Hi, I'm Tim. Welcome to Watchbox, and thanks for logging on. Today we have a rematch, and it's one for the ages. Rolex Submariner versus Omega Seamaster Diver 300 meter. It's the Cermit versus the white ceramic versus starts now. Okay, we've done this comparison several times, but with different versions of the watches in question. Now, since we have a redesigned Rolex Submariner, it's best to take this watch and compare it to the latest versions of the Diver 300 meter. Now, it's true you can get these watches with other strap, bracelet, and even medals, but we're going to compare these directly relatable watches, both in stainless steel. So we're going to start with the green sub. Whether you call it the Hulk, the Cermit, the Cermit, a lot of folks have settled on Cermit as it is a ceramic bezel version of the original 50th anniversary sub, the first lunette vert or green bezel sub from 2003. So the watch is 41 millimeters in diameter in 904L steel, which is a bit more corrosion resistant at the limit than the 316 stuff used in the Omega, but we are talking very fey differences. They are both quite durable. Now, what really changes here is that there are a few small revisions in size. Although it's claimed to be a 41 versus the previous 40, I'm only measuring an extra 0.7 of a millimeter of diameter. The thickness I'm measuring is exactly the same as the old watch, 12.4 millimeters, from lug tip to lug tip, exactly the same, 48.2 millimeters, and end link to end link. The total distance across the wrist is, again, just 0.7 of a millimeter larger than the previous measurement. However, it does have a broader 21 millimeter spacing between the lugs. We'll put the watch on my wrist. My wrist is 16 centimeters in circumference. Get a look at how it wears. The real advantage of this watch over the Seamaster is going to be just how thin it is. Now, without talking about the financials, this is a much flatter watch, and you'll really see that when I put the Seamaster on the wrist. They're comparably broad across the wrist, but this one is wonderfully slim, and that's one of the great virtues of just about all Rolex watches, with the exception of the Sea Dweller and the Deep Sea. The timepiece wears well, though you do need a big-ish wrist to wear this well. I'd say 15 centimeters circumference or larger, because it is fairly broad across the wrist. Now, taking a look at the bracelet, you can see it's the 3-link oyster design, satinated tops. It does have polished flanks. Removable links are fixed by screws. Clasp design is one of the big distinctions between these two watches. Here we have a beak and a hook, and let's get a little bit closer, get some detail. You can see there is a lift lock system internally. It's a leveraged spring-loaded system. Watch it latch in place, and then you lock it a second time using the clamshell. So this is actually a double locking clasp. Now, whereas a standard Rolex watch will have the 5mm easy link adjustment internally, here you can see, by the way, take note, we have 1/2 size link, but here you can see we have 20 millimeters of adjustment in 2mm increments. And this is great for fine-tuning size, but if you want to just pull it all the way out over a big thick dive suit or a coat or a sweater, you can do that too. It gives you a lot of incremental adjustment, both many increments and a lot of total range. Jumping back to the case, you can see this is less of a super case profile than the previous ceramic bezel sub. The lugs are a little bit thinner. They do come to more of a distinct taper rather than being broad and squared off. Here you can see that internally the lugs have been hollowed out a bit as the 20mm bracelet end link is expanded by 1mm, and all of that came from the inner faces of the lugs. So externally they have the same dimensions across, but they look a lot thinner. We have a crown, of course, a triplock crown screw down. The watch is 300 meters water resistant. And then we have a bezel that is a lovely knurling, both to look at and to touch. It's wonderfully fine and sharp and easy to grip, even if your hands might be slimy or wet, or if you're wearing gloves, you're going to have no problems here. There's a wonderful glide to the 120 click bezel. Now, the bezel insert itself is green ceramic, highly scratch resistant. Along with the sapphire, that means a lot of the blows that hit the watch are just going to be deflected by the hard materials. We've got platinum deposits inside the bezel. Everything that's a character or an index is actually a little silver platinum deposit to resist oxidation, tarnish, or discoloration over time. Dial has hands and indices, both in white gold for the same reason platinum is used in the bezel. And then we have a black lacquered base. Inside the case, caliber 3235, chronometer certified, but Rolex takes it one step further, adjusting the cased-up watch to run no worse than -2 + 2 seconds per day. They call that superlative chronometer. So you've got the 70-hour power reserve, stop seconds, quick set date, a very shock-resistant architecture with a rotor bearing, full balance bridge, and a free-sprung balance. It is highly anti-magnetic, beats away at 4 Hertz, and it is a Rolex manufacturer movement. That is the 3235. Okay, now this watch retails for $10,600 new as of 2022. Pre-owned, you'll see them between about $21,000 and $23,000, depending on condition, age, warranty remaining, and accessories. So let's jump from the known quantity, the evergreen, the Porsche 911 of dive watches, because remember, this came out in 1953. Well, let's jump to a watch that is, for the last quarter century plus, been a real credible contender. Now, the Seamaster dive watches date back to 1957, but it was really the 1993 arrival of the Diver 300 meter that coined the first enduring, multi-generational Seamaster design that could be called both evergreen and a true rival to the Rolex Submariner. And I'll be honest, both of them have close associations with James Bond. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Let's talk about basics. So this watch is the 2019 dial and bezel variation on the 2018 redesign of the Diver 300 meter. All of the elements from 1993, albeit with better quality, are still present in the watch. It's 42 millimeters in diameter versus 41 for the previous model. It's 13.8 millimeters thick. From lug tip to lug tip, it is 50 millimeters, and it has a 20 millimeter spacing between the lugs. So straps used on the previous generation will actually fit just fine on this one. Now we're going to throw this on my wrist once again. I'm going to recommend that you have a wrist of at least 15 centimeters circumference to wear this well. Could a smaller wrist wear it? Maybe, but I want to make sure that I'm a little bit conservative in these ratings. In the past, I think I've often overestimated the ability of a large watch to wear on a small wrist. So rather than saying this is going to wear on a 14 centimeter wrist, looking at my 16 centimeter circumference wrist, I'd say 15 is the limit here. Now, if you take a look at the watch, it's not ungainly or excessively thick the way, say, a Planet Ocean or a Ploprof would be, but it is not thin, certainly not by Rolex or Tudor Black Bay 58 standards. So while the watch will work with most cuffs, it's not quite as gracefully slim and razor-like as the Submariner. Now, taking a look at the bracelet, you can see this is a descendant of the long-running design used on those original Pierce Brosnan James Bond Seamaster Diver 300 meters in the 90s. So we have this 5 primary link design with polished intermediates and satin primaries, and you can see, unlike the original versions of this bracelet, there's a much more squared off break from the tops of the links to the shoulders of the links, and then we've got screws fixing removable links. On the originals from the 90s, these would have been pin sleeves. You can see that there's a micro link on both sides, but you've got a lot of adjustment built into this clasp. You can see there's one locking factor here. We don't have the lift lock in the clamshell. We have a trigger actuated system. Both of these watches feature very thick gauge clasps, and we have a fold-out dive extension here, but then we also have 9.6 millimeters of incremental adjustment via a push-button slider. I would say in terms of total extension, this is your easy winner. If you need a really big dive extension, this is going to be the obvious choice. The Rolex is a little bit more controllable in terms of adjustment because it is 10 different steps rather than one big pull-out and then a couple of incremental sliding steps. The clasp is nicely made. You can see it has a combination of satin and polish, and you can see that when we roll to the case, a very familiar case design. Crown guard profiles, lyre-style lugs with the inward and the outward bevel. For 2018, we gained a new style of the helium escape valve. This is for saturation divers using exotic mixtures. If air, or I should be more precise, helium intrudes into your watch, these are very small molecules, and they will be able to get past the seals. Well, this little valve, which you open manually, and by the way, on this generation, you can still open it while you are submerged. This little valve will open internally and release pressure if the internal pressure exceeds external pressure by more than 2 to 3 bars. This will prevent the helium from bursting your crystal and blowing out the seals of the watch. And again, for 2019, you can open it while you're still underwater. Plus, I should mention, there is a conical profile to the bezel now. It has or I should say the crown here. It's a little bit more like a Reese's peanut butter cup. Now, the watch is 300 meters water resistant like the Sub. It does have a screw down crown. We have a 120 click bezel. It's definitely louder and chunkier in its action than the Rolex. It doesn't feel quite as crisp or refined. And I'll also mention that because of the way the knurling is cut onto the bezel, it can be a little bit slippery and difficult to grasp if you don't have bare hands and dry hands. Now, the dial, unlike Rolex, uses gloss white ceramic. So it has a lot of the qualities of enamel in terms of gloss, durability, resistance to contaminants, and atmospheric factors. It will age gracefully. It doesn't have the vulnerability to damage quite, or the expense that comes with ceramic. We have blackened skeleton-style hands, which are a long-time signature of these so-called James Bond Seamasters, and then laser-etched into the dial the Omega Wave that launched on the original 1993 watch. Now, that original 93 watch would have featured a printed dial. Here we have blackened applique indices, a nice upscale look. The date moves from 3 o'clock down to 6 for this generation of the watch, and we get a full-time offering of a display case back. The movement is an ETA made but Omega exclusive, caliber 8800. Automatic winding, 55-hour power reserve, stop seconds, quick set date, anti-magnetic escapement, and hairspring in silicon. We have a full balance bridge with a free sprung index for shock tolerance. The winding rotor bearing also works to mitigate the effects of shock. It is a coaxial escapement as invented by George Daniels, which I still find technically very cool. It does help to improve performance, chronometry, and intervals between service. And then this is a 35 joule movement that beats away at a silicon hairspring specific 25,200 vibrations per hour, and it is a master chronometer, as Omega calls it. This is a standard created by Omega, along with the Swiss Federal Institute of Metrology, or measurements, and it is a test of the fully assembled watch. It goes by the chronometer testing standards, the ISO 3159 used by the COSC, but it's a full watch test in 6 positions, not 5, and it includes winding efficiency, power reserve, shock resistance, anti-magnetism, and water resistance. So master chronometer is a test of the entire watch. There's a lot to love here. Let's talk about all the way these watches are the same. Okay, they have the same warranty, 5 years if you buy them new. The clasps work differently. This one offers more incremental adjustment if you want to be precise about sizing, whereas this one offers more total extension. I'm not going to declare one better than the other. In terms of bracelet look, you can see they could not be more different. But in terms of feel and solidity, they appear and feel to be of the same level of quality. I'll also mention that the James Bond link might have seemed a bit contrived with Omega, as back in the 90s, it was clearly a pile of cash from Swatch Group that put this watch on Bond's wrist. But again, it's been a quarter century, and at this point, it feels quite fitting. It actually feels right to see Bond wearing an Omega at this point, whereas in the past, the literary references to Rolex provided a tougher and more durable tie between Rolex and 007, but this has enough good Bond movies behind it at this point and enough water under the bridge that I feel like they're both pretty natural Bond watches. One is no more contrived than the other. Bond, after all, is not a real person. And in terms of lume, I would argue that the dial on the Rolex has more legible individual indices. And I would argue that maybe the hands are more visible on the Omega. Let's do a quick lume shot here. You decide. Okay, you can see that the Omega features a differential lume for the minute hand and the bezel pearl, so you can easily tell those apart from the rest of the dial. Now, I get the feeling that the indices on the Omega are bigger, but the ones on the Rolex with their chromolite blue lume are somehow brighter. You can also see Rolex has solid hands, but they're relatively small. Omega has skeletonized hands, but they're broader. I can't make this call, so I'm calling it equal. Okay, now what do I like about each one? Well, with the Rolex, the greatest advantage is just how compact it is. For a 300-meter automatic diver, it is very slim. 12.4 millimeters versus 13.8. You can really see the difference. When you put these two watches together, the Omega is an absolute chunk compared to the Rolex. And we'll get a little bit closer and emphasize that so you can see them up close and see the difference. Now it's a little bit more evident. The Omega is much thicker than the Rolex. And the Rolex, in my opinion, because it's less massive and quite a bit thinner, it is a better fit. At least on my wrist, I think it's a better fit for a smaller arm. It also has a superior bezel. The way it feels, the way it sounds, the knurling, which is sharper and easier to grip, it's a clear advantage. Also, this is the one to buy new. If you buy this new for $10,600, you'll never lose a cent. At this point, you can sell the watch for more than twice what you paid. You could wear it for a year and then sell it and make a substantial profit. this is an incredible buy if you get it at list. I would also say that it's pretty obvious. This has a 70-hour power reserve. This has a 55-hour power reserve. 70 is substantially more than 55, and so this watch has an advantage on that basis. It also has a richer history dating back in recognizable form, no less, to 1953. Also, frankly, there's no planned obsolescence. This watch is still recognizable. If you put it next to the earliest subs from the 1950s, this is recognizably a descendant of those, and the owner of one of those back in the 50s would recognize this as a evolution of his watch. Whereas if you go back to the 50s, the 60s, even the 70s and the 80s, the Seamasters looked much different than this. And so there hasn't been the same durability of style until the Diver 300 meter, which again has been substantially the same design, evolving like the Submariner since 1993. But still, 1993 is not 1953. So in terms of heritage and immunity to planned obsolescence, we still have to give credit to the Rolex. There are also fewer variants of the Rolex Submariner, whereas there are literally a million versions diluting the Seamaster name. Even in the current catalog, there's simply fewer variants of the sub, so you always know when you're looking at a sub, whereas a Ploprof and an Aquaterra have almost nothing but the Seamaster name in common. So let's jump to the Omega. Obviously, this is a better value new or used. Buy it new, $5,400. Buy this one used, it's going to be between about $5,200 and $5,400. So if you pay $5,400 new, you could sell the watch in a private sale for just about what you paid. You're not going to make money, you're not going to lose money, but it will be a much more accessible watch because $5,400 is not $10,600, and it's definitely not $22,000 to $23,000. I would also say that the display case back, for a lot of folks who maybe aren't snobs about movement finish and understand that this is an industrially finished caliber, if they still want to see it, Omega gives you that. And there's no compromise in water resistance. They're both 300 meters. So for a lot of folks, seeing the movement still carries a lot of value, even when it's a machine-made movement. So on that basis, advantage Omega. There is the helium escape valve. Is this necessary? Does anyone use it? Well, probably not. And I would argue, no, it's not necessary. But I would also say that 904L steel isn't necessary. And yet we count that as an advantage of the Rolex. So yeah, it's a cool conversation piece. It's a conversation starter, and if you are that 1 in 1,000 professional diver, it could be useful. I would also say there's less brand baggage here. Most people are not going to come up unprompted and ask you whether your Omega's real or what you paid for it, and you're less likely to be cased by thieves while wearing your Omega. It's a sad fact, but it's also the reality of the world we live in, that this can attract unwanted attention, and this is less likely to do so. I would also say that realistically, this watch gives you more options. The flip side of having a lot of variants is choice. There are more dial colors available with this watch, more bezel colors available. There are nice factory straps, several different types with clasps even. There are several different metal options, including a no-date version of this in titanium. There's a titanium tantalum and rose gold version. There are the Bond-inspired models and the special event models, such as the Olympic collection. So you've got more special editions and variants to find the perfect Seamaster Diver 300 meter for you if you buy this watch. So we talked about what they do well, what each one does better, and some ways in which they are more or less the same. And I'm going to say that this is the better buy. There is no question that for so much less money, effectively half the price, even new, this is a better buy. It's the smarter buy. It allows you to put your money into other watches or fun vacations on which to take your Omega Diver. That said, this is the better watch, and from the extra power reserve to the history, the immunity to planned obsolescence, the particular way the 20mm adjustment works in the clasp, the ease of turning the bezel, the quality of the bezel feel and the sound, the extra 10 hours of power reserve, I'm going to have to say that price no object, I buy the Rolex. If price is a consideration, I buy the Omega. But which one do I think is objectively the better watch? It is the Rolex. Let me know in the description below which of these two you feel is the better of the two and which one you would buy, price no object and price as an object.